So I hope everyone can see that. A&D and Global Challenges 101. I don't have much time to get through a very big subject, so I'm going to take off straight away and obviously thank everyone for having me on this panel today. It's a great pleasure to share some of these important views with you all. Just to take you back to the genesis of my own interest in this, I used to be a reporter with Jane's Defence Weekly. I joined Jane's in 1986. And towards the end of my time there in 2005, I was responsible for a series of articles which I called Technology Audit. And the idea of this was to look at the science and technology base of the 9 aerospace and defence sector primes, which at that time I felt had sort of all become rather samey. You know, they all looked and did pretty much the same thing. So having persuaded the chief technology officers of these companies and their public relations counterparts, of course, that this was a good idea, which was not always apparent to them, because the idea of opening up their science and technology basements to a reporter came with some risk. But having done that, it became a very interesting exercise for me. I was able to benchmark the S&T. I saw a number of trends emerging from that, including some worrying ones, which was, as I say here, a sort of stagnation potentially in macro innovation. You know, where was the next Apollo? Where was Concorde? You know, where was the next space shuttle? There were also some worrying signs about the average age of an aerospace and defense sector worker. This is sort of 15 years ago now. It was in the average age was about the mid-50s. It's still in the mid-40s. And, you know, that left me wondering about, you know, what might be the underlying causes of that. But the overriding conclusion I came to was that there was a wealth of untapped technology out there with some sector problems underneath them all. So if we think of what we see in the aerospace and defense sector as an iceberg, what I submit that you do see in terms of the platforms that the sector builds, in other words, ships, aircraft, tanks, and weapon systems, is the bit above the waterline you see of an iceberg. Very little, in fact. But what is below the waterline is generic science and technology and know-how that is applicable to a great many other sector needs. One of which, it was very clear, was climate, because the aerospace and defense sector builds a range of technology and capability that spans, as we've seen in this fabulous webinar series, orbitals, deep space technology even, right the way through the atmosphere into subsea. So it clearly knew about areas like climate, I thought, but what was stopping this technology that could go to help some of these grand global challenges? What was stopping them coming through? Well, the answer, of course, is that governments exert the pull factor. In fact, the defense side of aerospace and defense companies doesn't move unless governments exhort them to. But it struck me too that this was technology that we as taxpayers and of course governments had paid for. So why was it sitting below the waterline? And one of the fundamental capabilities that came through in this Jane's audit that I did was, of course, that all of these 9 prime contractors had this unrivaled systems of systems capability to build and put together big architectural stuff. So the key thing that came out of this for me was, how did we access all of this potential from below that waterline on that imaginary iceberg, and how did it map to grand global challenges? Well, when I assembled 8 of the 9 CTOs together in Washington, DC at a conference with President Obama's science advisor, John Holdren, the conclusion we came to was that the technology was there. It could be exerted on grand global challenges. The problem was the aerospace and defense sector's business model. As it says on this slide here, A&D companies don't assume risk on their own dollar. They get governments to pay for their risky endeavors, so whether that's in development activity or in production. They very rarely put money into that themselves. So because most global challenges interface with the commercial world, we found ourselves at an enormous deadlock and impasse. And then, as I say here, in 2014, ISIS emerged as a threat, Russia annexed Crimea, and all of this wonderful activity that we'd been looking at to try and loosen up aerospace and defense sector science, technology, and know-how into the grand global challenge domain sort of went away. This 5-year window just closed in 2014. But of course, the grand global challenges hadn't gone away. And in 2020, this was really the year everything changed. When the pandemic struck, we saw what aerospace and defense could do, because a lot of these companies that you see down on the bottom left-hand side of the screen had mobilized to build ventilators and respirators and PPE. So this was demonstrable proof of what could be done. So my response, and I'm delighted to say abetted by my colleagues, a number of whom are on this panel today, we said, well, if A&D is doing its bit and nurses and doctors are doing their thing, and everyone else a lot of other people are responding to the COVID-19 challenge, what could we do? Well, the answer was I launched something on my corporate strategic storytelling website called Call to Action. And Call to Action really does tell a very different side of the A&D story. It demonstrated that A&D could rise to a grand challenge. It demonstrated too that it had systems of systems skills and tech know-how that it could bring to bear. It was also able to operate cross-sector. And it had an extremely agile response when it needed to in this predominantly sort of commercial arena. It could adapt its SME base and its supply chain to respond to an emergency like the pandemic. And a key one for me was that it should engage the Millennial and Generation Z mindset, because as we saw earlier, the Generation Z and Millennial generations weren't engaging in the aerospace and defense sector as they perhaps should have been for those unknown reasons I mentioned at the beginning. But the key point was, if A&D can do this for one global challenge, imagine what it can do for the full panoply of them. So we've launched this call to action, as I say. It is a top-down, bottom-up endeavor. From the top down, we're interviewing key people in and outside the aerospace and defense sector. So that will range from people in NGOs who have a humanitarian or a need on the humanitarian front line, and also people within the sector who are beginning to appreciate, I think themselves, that they have key capability to lend to these global grand challenges. From the bottom up, we are addressing a social media campaign, and particularly keen to bind the Millennial and Generation Z generations into this discussion, because without them, it's really not going to work. The global grand challenge problems, whilst they are here, are predominantly going to strike in the generations ahead. So we need that engagement. So that is largely it from me for now. I just want to sort of summarize by saying call to action is an awareness campaign. It's about making governments aware that this prepaid asset exists. And as it says here on this slide, we have calculated, based on some pretty meaningful discussions with people in the sector, that each major aerospace and defense nation has about $1 trillion of IP and know-how locked up in the aerospace and defense sector that can be brought to bear on global grand challenges. If governments act, we know that aerospace and defense will follow, and it has a track record of what I say here is doing the impossible, getting human beings onto the moon, or building a phenomenal Mark II transport aircraft like Concorde. There is absolutely no time to waste. And this is an endeavor that is not just something aerospace and defense should be doing for all kinds of moral and ethical reasons, but because there is money in it. This is an adjacent market to the core market of aerospace and defense. No one, least of all me, is advocating it should give up. But this is what is calculated to be at least a $4 trillion adjacency that sits alongside the $2 trillion annual global defense market. I also happen to think that it will reinvigorate aerospace and defense. And obviously, I'm very keen to hear what the panel and our esteemed guests and attendees to this webinar session today, what you think as well. But with that, thank you very much indeed.